Waiting on everything to sync up. I believe Facebook is already working this morning. All right. And let me get this started as well. Well, I guess not. All right, maybe I'll mess with that tomorrow. I was trying to create a space in Twitter for the first time, but I've never really messed with it. So we'll save that for another time. By the way, good morning and welcome to the 20th episode of the Daily Grind. My name is Michael Price and I am your host, and today we are going to be talking a little bit more about book two and hopefully applying some more of the concepts that we've been going over when it comes to the rules of engagement, um, as well as some of the different laws that we've went over: the law of reality, non-contradiction, identity, excluded middle. And so I'm looking forward to, hopefully we'll find some depth in this second chapter of the book. The first chapter was a lot more of a narrative than it was about the actual content that's being discussed primarily in this podcast. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can look up the books at burdenofproof.co. If you go to even the home page, I think there's a button to download book one free. That's probably the easiest way. But on the shop page, it has the first two books available. As of right now, you can download the first one for free. You just hit add to cart, you click a couple more buttons. It won't ask for any information or any money of any kind, so it's absolutely free. I'm going to try to make that a little easier to do, maybe a one button push like I have for the first book on the home page, just so that there's no kind of struggle with getting that first book downloaded. Also, I'm planning to go ahead and make the second book free as well. The more I think about it, the podcast goes into more depth than the books even do on the subject matter, and the ultimate goal is that we can grow in finding the truth and wisdom together, and to put some kind of a price tag on that feels like it's creating friction where there shouldn't be any. And so for now, at least with book two, I'm going to go ahead here soon and take the price tag off of it as well, so that anyone who wants to have access to that can and will. And I hope that y'all will take advantage of that opportunity. And what I meant by the book isn't necessarily offering things that the podcast is. The book tells a narrative. It incorporates the ideas into a practical fiction story that allows us to kind of live vicariously through the characters without maybe putting up our normal defense systems that we put up when we're having a one-on-one conversation, and it feels like the beliefs that we have are under attack. And when we see it from an outside perspective, like a book, we can recognize that it's not about an attack of character or an attack of beliefs. It's about a search for clarity. And so at least it helped me to examine my own beliefs through writing these books, to take an outside perspective on it, maybe not take so personally the fact that many of the things that I believed weren't correct, and I had to reevaluate. And there was some that I could hold fast to. If y'all don't know the catchphrase of the whole podcast, the whole book series, it's test everything and hold fast to what is true. And I found there were some things that I can hold fast to. But for the most part, I had a ton of it wrong. Um, and maybe I had some of the core correct, but it required me going all the way down to the foundation and relaying some of the groundwork. Because even if some of it was right, I didn't understand how it was built. I was just lucky to get anything right, for that matter. I didn't plan that out. I didn't test it correctly. I didn't even know you could test, because in this society, yes, we say we can test, but ultimately there's this caveat that comes with testing anything. Well, you can never really know 100%. And if that's true, then we don't even know the evidence we have is evidence at all. And so we're just walking around pretending like we have some kind of certainty when we don't. If we can't say anything is 100% certain. And maybe then that's not what people told me. Maybe that's just what I picked up somewhere along the way, thinking that someone had taught it to me. It wouldn't be the first time I imagine someone taught something to me and I actually perceived it on my own. So we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that wasn't necessarily their intention, but I think you'll still see it's prevalent in the daily world around you. People consistently trying to give each other advice and point others in the right direction, while within only a short few sentences or days or weeks they make a comment showing that they don't actually know anything for certain. And once again, as I said, if you reflect that all the way back, that means not even knowing that the evidence, not even knowing the direction you're pointing really is the best direction at all. How do we even prove it's a direction to begin with? I know that seems like a silly question, but most of us have never taken the time to think about it. And I was thinking about a logically complete chain. And I didn't learn about the word or the phrase being logically complete until I started writing this book series. I kind of understood it in concept, in the idea that for a thing to be true, you had to make sure every part of the claim was correctly formed and true. What I didn't understand about it is that chain had to have a link all the way to the beginning of existence in order to verify anything absolutely. And that is a daunting task. I don't know if any of you have already tried to undertake it to find any kind of absolute truth. But this is what the philosophers spent time doing, and maybe some of them grasped concepts. I've read some of the writings and found similar things to the law of reality that I introduced. I believe it was around episode 14 or 15. Um, but I definitely didn't hear it stated that way. But that's essentially what they were doing. They were trying to find out what is the what is existence and reality already built on, regardless of what I think about it. And then they would give a term to it, a name to what already existed, what was already true. It's not like they were creating something new, they were just putting a title on it. And so a lot of what I'm going to be doing is doing something similar to that, is finding these discoverable concepts that are built by logical necessity. What I mean is logical necessity is they proceed forth automatically from the prior conclusions, from the prior laws that already exist. And so it builds a logically complete chain from reality itself to whatever direction that you are trying to get to in order to verify that something is true. And there are ways in which to apply these different steps, not just to the concept of searching for truth as a whole, but in your daily circumstances, in the struggles with your relationships, with your job, with your long term plan for where you want to be in 10 years, and for what you decide you're going to do with your plans today. What are the constraints of what you need to accomplish versus where do you have time to adapt your plan? How should we prioritize it? What is the hierarchical order? Um, and the method is intended to help with all of these things. And I look forward to sharing more of the steps with you as we go along. Today, though, we are going to be discussing Book 2, A Solid Foundation, and we're going to go ahead and get started with Chapter 2. Let me see if I can get that pulled up so that you're able to see it, and get my glasses so that I am able to see it here. But one moment here. All right, should be able to see that now. Chapter 2 of Book 2, A Solid Foundation, which I said is not on the web page free just yet, but I am going to do that here shortly. And it's not a matter of trying to make any sales before I do, it's a matter of those constraints that I was talking about a moment ago, where I am having a very busy few weeks, and so I'll try to get that done in the next day or two so that those who have already read book 1 and they're looking forward to reading book 2 didn't want to pay the $7 at the moment. I completely understand. I want you to be able to examine these things freely, enjoy this series freely. Ultimately, I did not write it for money, and I would do this podcast, this book, regardless of ever if it ever profits anything other than that it brings benefit to my own life and to your lives as well. And so I hope that it does so. So, book 2, A Solid Foundation, chapter 2. Are you sure about that? And one more thing, if you're wanting to hear book 1, I think there was a couple of episodes. I wish I could tell you which ones. I know they were prior to episode 10. So probably somewhere between 5 and 10 that I read book 1 in 2 parts. So you're welcome to check that out. And yesterday's episode 19, I read chapter 1 of book 2. By Thursday, Marcus had found a rhythm, digging through pages, tracing citations, cross-checking sources. It wasn't the workload that surprised him, it was how familiar the patterns felt. He didn't know every term yet, but he recognized the moment an argument bent under its own weight, the same way he recognized the look someone got when they were forming a question, but couldn't quite find the right words. That brief, strained hesitation, that shift in the eyes, arguments did the same thing when something underneath them wasn't stable. He walked into Chin's office with a binder full of notes. Claim 7, Marcus said, setting it down. It's wrong. Chin brightened. Which part? All of it. Chin leaned back, interested. Show me. Marcus pointed to the paragraph. You said Kantian's claim the burden of proof sits entirely on consequentialists because deontology doesn't depend on empirical evidence. Yes. Well, the problem is you're treating all Kantians like they agree on one thing when they really don't. Chin tilted his head, listening. By the way, if you don't understand all of this discussion, don't worry too much about that because that's not what we're focused on here. What we're really focused on is this part here where it's talking about the problem is treating all Kantians like they agree on one thing when they really don't. One of the scholars you cite actually argues the opposite, that even moral rules need explanation, and Kant spends a lot of time trying to justify his system. If his view didn't need proof, he wouldn't have spent whole chapters defending it. Marcus tapped the page. So essentially, you summarized a whole group of thinkers as if they held the same exact position, but they don't. Some believe what you wrote, and some don't. It's way more mixed than that sentence makes it sound. Chin nodded slowly, impressed. So the fallacy? Overgeneralization. Marcus said, you took a messy set of views and made them look clean, easier to write, but not accurate. Recommendation, Chin asked. Separate the camps, show both sides. Otherwise, the argument leans on a version of Kantian thought that isn't actually universal. Chin jotted a note, then let a small smirk slip. Well argued, but Marcus, you may have committed a hasty generalization yourself. Marcus blinked. How do you figure? You told me the entire claim was wrong, all of it. Yet Didn't some of those scholars believe exactly the thing I summarized? Marcus didn't hesitate. He gave Chin a dry, knowing look. Nice try. A statement is either true or it's false. No middle ground. Chin laughed softly. Nice use of the law of excluded middle. So actually, this chapter is going to be a really, really good example. And if you've been watching prior episodes when I went through the laws of engagement, I believe that's episodes 10 through 13 approximately. Um, you'll know that I didn't spend a lot of time on particular fallacies like overgeneralization because I understood that if we spend a bunch of time on that, we still may never get to all the different fallacies you can encounter. But instead, we could take preventative measures like isolating claims, fixing terms, making sure that we're not hedging. Hedging just means finding a way to avoid answering, whether that be attacking someone's character or using words like um, theoretically, hypothetically speaking, metaphysically speaking, in order to avoid actual talk of truth. And so you're welcome to go and check those out. As I said, before I have any live venue discussion, it is my intention to go ahead and put the list of the full rules of engagement up. But if you're interested in checking those out, I would encourage you to go ahead because they're not just useful for this podcast. They help us to quit talking past each other in our daily lives and in our relationships with one another. So, let's see, where was I at here? And then we talked about the nice use of excluded middle. So, that just goes back to a claim is either true or it's false. It can't be partially true. And so he's making the claim that Kantians believe this. That's the singular claim being made here. And Marcus is arguing back saying, actually, that is not true. All of that is wrong. It's entirely wrong. And Chin's like, well, some of them believe that. And he said, but we're not discussing what some people believe and others don't believe. What we're discussing is the claim you made here. And the claim is that Kantians believe this. That is entirely false. And it can't be partially true because a statement is either true or it's false by the law of excluded middle. And Chin acknowledges this. Marcus nodded once. High praise coming from you. Chin waved a hand. Don't get used to it. Chin flipped a few pages. Continue. Marcus turned to the next claim. In your chapters on Aristotelian ethics, you lean on Aristotle's name instead of supporting the premises. Chin raised a brow. Can you give me a practical example from the manuscript? Here, Marcus said, sliding it closer. You treat Aristotle's endorsement as if it's evidence that the idea is true. That's likely accepting a claim. That's like accepting a claim because someone respected said it. The authority becomes the argument. Chin nodded. Good. Continue. Marcus pointed to the next section. This utilitarian summary. Straw man. You presented the shallow version, maximize happiness, but skipped the serious arguments, long-term consequences, intentions, and systemic effects. Chin gestured. Walk me through that one. Here, Marcus said, tapping a paragraph. You claim utilitarians ignore minority well-being. That's only true of the simplified view, not the real academic ones. You're arguing against a weaker version than the one they actually defend. Fallacy? Straw man, Marcus said, misrepresenting their argument as a weaker one in order to make it easier to refute. In reality, you're not even refuting the real claim in the first place. Exactly, Chin replied. All right. So, not too much to add to this because it actually does a pretty good job of the book itself explaining what's going on here, what a straw man is. It's setting up a false argument that's weaker than the one that the other person actually made in order so that you can dismantle it. When in reality, you haven't actually discussed the real claim that your opponent is discussing. A lot of times that's done by some of the things we just talked about. Maybe term shifting, twisting their claim, adding another claim into it instead of keeping the claim isolated, those type of things. It's really a form of hedging. Once again, avoiding addressing the actual argument. And that's what, at least that's what we call it here on the podcast. Hedging is usually used in a more specific sense of just adding words to avoid speaking in absolute truth. I stretch that meaning because I don't think I'm really stretching it. What I mean is, I think I'm giving it its full range of motion, because that's really what we're doing anytime we find any way to avoid giving a straight answer about truth or reality, is we're adding something else in to avoid giving the answer, no matter what that is. If that's an ad hominem, an attack on somebody's character, that is still finding a way to add in material in order to avoid addressing the truth. All right. Why does it seem like you knew that already? Marcus asked. The best explanation given after a thorough examination of the evidence is the one that is simplest and requires the least amount of logical leaps. Marcus knew that one too. Occam's razor, also known as the law of parsimony. So the law of parsimony is the best explanation given after a thorough examination of the evidence, is the one that is the simplest and requires the least amount of logical leaps. Wait a second, Marcus interjected. Under the circumstance that an undergraduate philosophy student had written these documents, this amount of errors would seem plausible, even likely. The odds that a professor of philosophy of your caliber and experience would make this many errors without noticing, slim to none. By law of parsimony, the most likely explanation is that you did not write these manuscripts. So either you intentionally made errors in order to test to see if I am suitable for the position, or I am grading the papers of your philosophy students, since taking all the extra time to make mistakes would be wasted effort when your desk is already piled high with mountains of papers filled with fallacies in need of being caught. The simplest explanation is that I was wrong when I said or. What do you mean? Chin asked. I mean, the answer is both. Two birds, one stone. You save time while I grade papers. If I do well, the grading is already done. You find I am right for the position, and I learn how to pick out logical fallacies without you having to take the time to make up hypotheticals. Marcus replied. It's a legendary level philosophical and psychological application, which is exactly what I would expect from you. Pretty legendary application yourself, Chin replied. Let's keep going, though. Papers don't grade themselves. Both of them outwardly laughing because they could no longer contain it. All right. This section shifts the topic mid-argument. He said while attempting to recompose himself. This student goes from asking whether objective morality exists to whether society likes morality. That's a red herring, changing the question. Chin gave a thin smile. Good catch. Marcus flipped a page. And here, this one. Chin waited. They framed the disagreement like there were only two options, Marcus said. That every moral choice has to come from intuition or a logical choice, as if the reason for the decision ultimately has to be one or the other. That's a false dilemma. Chin paused. Are you absolutely sure about that? He asked, his voice slower now. Intentional. Marcus stopped. He thought for a moment. I was, he said, until you asked it that way. He closed the manuscript slightly. I think I'll take some time to reconsider. Chin nodded once. Good. They moved on. And so this is going to be discussed a little bit more in later books, so I'll kind of leave that be for right now. If someone wants to ask more about this particular part of the book, you're welcome to send me an email at burdenofproofpublishing at gmail.com, or you can send me a private message on Facebook, and maybe we can go a little deeper into this idea of whether or not this really would be a false dilemma. They moved on. Marcus looked back down at the page, but the sentence didn't sit the same way anymore. Marcus paused on the last one. And here, emotional appeal. Chin lifted a brow. How so? They call one view comforting and the other cold. That's persuasion, not argument. Chin leaned back. You're intuitive, but don't get a big head. I could go all philosophical legend any time you need a solid dose of humility, but I'll contain it for now. Marcus chuckled again. He had never considered the possibility of a professor of philosophy, or any professor at all for that matter, that possessed the kind of humor that Chin did. Chin turned another page. There's something else. You keep strengthening the argument before attacking it. Most students weaken it. Marcus shrugged. Feels dishonest to argue against the weak version. That instinct, Chin said, is the principle of charity. Understanding an argument in its strongest form before evaluating it. Rare. Marcus said nothing. So with that one, the principle of charity is the idea of what we want to act out here on this podcast. And I hope that you're trying to act it out on a daily basis, because this right here, the principle of charity, is the difference between trying to win an argument and trying to seek truth and clarity. If you improperly represent your opponent's position, or your friend's position, or your family member's position, whoever it is that you're having a discussion with, then you're not actually addressing the real argument, which means you're not actually seeking truth or clarity. You're just trying to win. And so if your honest goal is to grow as a person, to grow in your relationships, to grow in your career, applying this principle of charity is one of the most effective tools that you have at your disposal to learn truth, to grow as a person. Chin tapped the manuscript. And this, your habit of tracing a problem to its cause. That's the principle of sufficient reason. And we'll be talking more about that not too long from now. But I think I've got that probably another 3 or 4 laws of logic down, so we should get to that fairly soon. But this is the idea behind what it is. Your habit of tracing the problem to its cause. So we will likely go into that after we finish reading book 2 day by day here. Marcus tilted his head, awaiting further explanation. He vaguely remembered Sarah using the term before, but couldn't quite remember the full scope of its meaning. Sorry about that, y'all. Things don't collapse without explanation, Chin said. If an argument breaks down, it is because the reasoning assumed underneath was not strong enough to bear the weight. It was already weak or broken. It just needed a little stress to expose the flaw. Flash, his dad in the chair. There's something I need to tell you, son. Flash, the ceiling crack spreading like a fault line. Chin watched him for a moment before returning to the manuscript. You're building a toolkit, Marcus. Not only for philosophy, for life. Marcus nodded. He wasn't sure which unsettled him more, how natural these concepts felt, or how much they reminded him of the things he never managed to fix before they collapsed. That evening, Sarah sat at their usual coffee shop table, 2 notebooks open, pen balanced behind her ear. How many claims did you destroy today? She asked. 7, Marcus said. Maybe 8. She grinned. Chin's going to adopt you. Marcus sat across from her. He tested me harder today. Good, Sarah said. He only pushes people who can take it. Learn anything new? Sarah asked. Charity, Marcus said. and sufficient reason. Sarah's eyes sharpened. Those aren't exactly beginner tools. How did you end up discussing those? They're things I've been doing without knowing the names. Sarah closed her notebook part way. Marcus, most people never learn to put those into practice, even when they do know the names, either because they're not sure how to see the argument from the opponent's perspective, or if they're afraid if they do, they might have to accept that the identity they've built their life around isn't a real identity at all. And I think that's a lot of the reason we tend to misrepresent each other, talk past each other, switch terms, combine claims, find all different forms of hedging, is to avoid this problem right here. We formed our identity around something that isn't true, and the collapse of those beliefs feels like the collapse of who we are. But according to the law of reality, falsehood doesn't actually exist. It's not bound by the laws of logic, meaning you're still going to be there. Even when the falsehood collapses, you're still going to be there. So the fact that we've been telling ourselves that these beliefs that are false are who we are, it is absolutely not true. That is not reality. And when it's only when those false beliefs begin to collapse under the scrutiny of logic that we can start to find who we truly are by stepping into reality. A drip echoed from behind the counter. Drip, 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 flash, the collapse. His dad's halting voice, the unfinished sentence. He blinked. You good? She asked. Yeah, just thinking. She packed her things. Monday's coming fast. Don't hold back. If truth does exist, it can handle the pressure. Marcus exhaled. On one hand, he feared that truth didn't exist, and if it didn't, then the only thing grounding him would fall away. On the other hand, he feared that truth exists, and what that meant about the implications on his own life. At this point, fear was no longer relevant to the argument. Either truth existed, or it didn't, and one way or another, he was going to find out which. And so I really like what it says here at the end. Truth either exists or it doesn't exist. And it talks about, at this point, fear was no longer relevant to the argument. I would suggest that fear was never relevant to the argument to begin with. Truth, reality, they exist independent of what we name them, what we think about them. And if you're not sure if that's true, I encourage you to try to refute the idea that reality exists. But it's going to require that you make a real statement in order to do so. Or try to refute the law of identity. But you're going to have to make a statement about an identifiable statement about the non-existence of identity in order to do so, which is also self-refuting. And to say the truth doesn't exist is a contradiction in itself, and you can't say the truth doesn't exist without existing. Once again, self-refuting. And the law of excluded middle. Well, truth partially exists. No, it either exists or it doesn't exist. It can't be anything in the middle. So any attempt to remove or refute these laws requires you to use the very laws themselves. And so any attempt to refute them will prove that these laws exist, that reality does exist, and that in fact truth does exist, because reality is inherently true. And we'll discuss that more in future episodes. I appreciate y'all joining over here for episode 20 of the Daily Grind, where we discussed chapter 2, book 2, A Solid Foundation. Once again, you can look those books up at burdenofproof.co or at burdenofproofpublishing.com. You can go ahead and download the first book on the home page or on the shop page completely free. As I said, I'm going to go ahead and make the second book free here shortly as well so that you can have access to that. And I hope that this has been beneficial. I'm excited that we actually got to cover quite a few different fallacies and got the opportunity to apply some of those laws of engagement, and even got to go through a lot of the material of the laws of logic. It particularly talked about some of them in there, the excluded middle there. So you got to see a real life fictional application of it. Um, but thank you so much for joining. We should I should have another episode available for you about 6:30 to 6:45 a.m. tomorrow morning, where we will go over chapter 3 of book 2. Um, and so that will be episode 21 of the Daily Grind, and I look forward to seeing y'all then.